Um, let's see. So this is the agenda for this evening. And we went over that. The agenda slide went quickly by, but this is a map, a bird's eye view map, which Dr. Dudley uses often in her research, which helps me understand that it is pretty factual, and the artist who would and company who would have drawn this would have really gone block by block to create an inventory, because this was long before aerial photography. 1873 in Austin was just under 2 square miles that you see here, with the north end border being what we now know as Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard. The city of Austin was founded in 1839, having been a small settlement called Waterloo, which had a few settlers' homes right at the bottom where you can see where Shoal Creek enters Lower Colorado River, about where the Central Library is now. And they'd drawn up a map of the city grid that was originally about 1.5 square miles in 1839. And the colonial settlers were coming into Austin from the American South primarily, for the purpose of land development and growing cotton in Texas. And they brought a number of enslaved people with them from the American South and came into Texas along likely the El Camino Real de las Tejas, which was an existing Native American trail route. And one of the first person that is understood that died was an enslaved person coming through the lower end of the trail through Bastrop, and they continued coming into Austin and buried him near our west gates at Oakwood Cemetery. He was the first person understood to be buried there. On this bird's eye view map, we've drawn an overlay of this little red rectangle and the blue rectangle, which are approximate. The red rectangle is the boundary of the cemetery as drawn in this bird's eye view map, which was about 4 acres as drawn. And the blue boundary map is an approximation of the now 40 acres that is just Oakwood Cemetery, not counting the Oakwood Annex, which is another 18 acres to the east. So I'm just trying to paint a picture of how small it was in 1873 after the Civil War. At that, in the 1870 survey, there are listed 4,428 residents. Of that, it was 36% were African American, which is a really different ratio of our population today. And the ratio was high, not only because there was chattel slavery and for the purpose of growing plantation cotton in Texas, but after the Civil War, a lot of the freed people moved to urban areas so that they could find their families and create their own economic purpose and free lives. So just south of where the blue line is would have been Robertson Hill, one of the early freedom colonies. And there are others that would be adjacent to this grid on the map at that time. But we're really thinking about a very distinct population. And as it relates to the cemetery, the mortality rate as that city grew over time. And we've done a lot of projects at the Oakwood Chapel looking at the growth of the city and looking at the cultures of people within specific areas or under specific themes. But we're really trying to put the context of the historic colored grounds, which was a segregated section of the cemetery, in context of the late 1800s, when people were buried there. That context is a difficult one because the segregated section included thousands of African Americans, as well as Mexican Americans and some European Americans, who were all marginalized in their lifetime, no matter what their economic status was. They were all placed within a certain area together. And it was not until Ms. Lott brought in an original deed from the 1880s that we understood that they did sell family lots. So she has provided our first evidence of that, which is a very big deal. So if you will show the next slide. This is a view of that section of the cemetery, and the structure at the bottom of the image is the Oakwood Chapel. It's about 1,000 square foot building. It's not very large. And you can see that a lot of the area to the left of the chapel and a bit to the northeast of the chapel is a pretty grassy area. There isn't as many monuments or curbed family lots. And the truth is it's very full of burials, and that the chapel was built on top of and within this section atop graves when it was built in the Jim Crow era in 1914. And so the chapel itself represents a very difficult history within this physical and social context. The 3D model example you're looking at, you might be familiar with Google Earth. It's kind of what you call a 3D mesh, where different photos are taken at different angles and they're all patched together to become a 3D model of real space. They combine aerial photos with street views, and then they patch it together. And in this case, Google Earth is enmeshed with Google Maps, so that you have narrative data location about physical places. And we call that a geospatial database. So the purpose of this project is to create a geospatial database with high resolution of this section of the cemetery for this grant. So what you're helping us inform is what the content of that data will be as we create a very high resolution 3D model of this space, which would allow you to have a virtual tour with all the information we can find about a person stored at their grave site, or in the case of unmarked graves, within the section of where they're buried, for the purpose of accountability and historic record. These people are the evidence of this difficult history, and our efforts are to preserve their memories and and find all the information that can be found about them. So when you say 3D model, people don't always know exactly what we mean. It can iterate then in many different ways once you build it from a gaming environment to a thing you look at through your phone through AR. So it just depends on how, once you build the information, it can evolve over time, but it's what goes into it that we're asking your input for. So if you have one more slide for us, Jody. So this image is a lot of news. So this image is the speculative location, not actual locations, of 2,397 unmarked graves of African Americans. This doesn't include the final count of the Mexican Americans, the European Americans buried within possibly this section, or if this is the final record of the geographic boundaries in which these people are buried. The pattern was randomized in our software, but all the white rectangles are roughly the size of a coffin, and they're not placed over existing known graves where there is curbing or monuments. And so this visualization is very much a first draft to just let you see and understand how many people were unaccounted for in the city's records. Record books were kept starting in 1859, but the full names of many people nor the locations were always listed. And that is the big accountability piece of this project. I sit in this information a lot, so please, other grant team members, prompt me if I've missed anything else in the introduction, but that is the context of this project. And our descendant voices are very important, as well as our community member experts who have approached other similar projects. So I'd like to introduce to you our grant team. Dr. Maria Franklin is an archaeologist at the University of Texas. She works in both African diaspora studies, and her research is on the focus of post-emancipation experiences of Black Texans. She was also one of the consulting archaeologists, not on the chapel project, but for the Altogether Here symposium we produced 2 years ago about the chapel burials. Dr. Tara Dudley is also a professor. She's an associate professor at the University of Texas in the School of Architecture, and her expertise is in historic preservation. And I met her when she came to find Thomas Hill's monument, and he was a Black stonemason who's buried actually to the northeast of the chapel, but is listed within the general record. So he is one particular exception in that he has a monument and he's listed in the general section, but he's a little northeast. And when I met Dr. Dudley, I was just delighted to have the opportunity to learn from her. And she is an expert in the built world of Austin and who did the building in the early days. Diana Hernandez is just finished her master's degree from the University of Texas School of Architecture in historic preservation also, and she is writing her PhD thesis in the near future on Mexican-American cemeteries, and has been working in cemetery preservation in Travis County. And we enjoyed having our staff participate in 2 symposiums over the last 2 years she produced. And Dr. Laura Cortez is our communications expert, and she helps make sure the conversations are moving along and are whole, and make sure that, since the city of Austin has not always earned everybody's trust, that we hope she is helping us do that in these conversations. I want to introduce my colleague, Greg Farrar. Greg is also a descendant of this section of the cemetery. His great-great-grandfather is Reuben Shannon Lovingood, the first president of Samuel Houston College. And Greg and I have been working together to research the records of the cemetery, but as well as the legacy of Houston-Tillotson University. And we published a very elaborate project last spring together that was just really meaningful. And he holds a really important point of view as a descendant and a staff member doing the work. And Caitlin Hill, who works as a program manager for the Cemetery Operations Division, and she is my counterpart. I work for the Museums and Cultural Programs Division of Parks, and Caitlin works for the Cemetery Operations Division of Parks. And we work together at Oakwood Cemetery to interpret the meaning of the lives of people buried there. Did I miss anything, Laura?
Jennifer, I learned something new every time we sit in these focus groups. Thank you for always providing a very thorough, always adding to what we're learning about this project. And before we get to learn a little bit about those of you that are joining us tonight, I wanted to give a couple of moments for our project team just to say a few words. They may know you, or they just may want to address you. And so I'm going to go ahead and open up the floor for our project team to say hello.
Hey, I just wanted to say hi to everybody. Thanks for being here, Darwin, Valerie, Sergio, and Melinda. We appreciate all your input and spending your time with us. Thank you.
Good evening. I echo what Greg and Jennifer have already said. Thank you so much for taking time this evening to be with us and converse about this project and how it can be meaningful for various constituents in Austin. So we appreciate you.
Yes, I want to say thank you as well for being here. I look forward to hearing about your perspectives, and thank you for sharing, being willing to speak to us about what you consider important about this project.
And good evening. Like everyone else has said, thank you for your time, and I look forward to learning from you all.
And I'll join everybody else in also thanking you for your time. We really do value your input. This project wouldn't mean nearly as much without the input of the time that you're taking. It's an amazing contribution. Thank you.
So with that, we'd like to learn a little bit about you. Some of us know you personally, but some of us, this is the first time we're hearing from you. And so we're just putting up a quick slide. We'd love to know if you could just share your name. If you're coming as a subject matter expert today, which I think all of us are subject matter experts of our own history, right? But if you're representing a specific organization, we'd love for you to share that. Where were you born? Since we are talking about our history, we also know that some of you are native Austinites, but where were you born? And if you weren't born here, when did you come to Austin, or have you been affiliated at all with this project? So we are going to hit mute on ours and allow it for it to be an open conversation. If you could just share a little bit about yourself.
I'll start. I'm Valor Lott. I'm a native of East Austin, and I appreciate you guys, what you're trying to do. Thank you very much. I have over at least 13 known ancestors, or let's say relatives, there at Oakwood. My great grandfather, Milton Wright, and his wife Caroline, they came to Austin in 1952. I mean, in 1852, enslaved. They have a nice monument there. They're one of the ones that have a marked grave. He could not read or write, but he was one of the trustees of the founding charter members of Wesley Chapel, the church that I grew up in. He and his wife, Caroline, that was in 1865. He was a trustee. You go to Wikipedia, you'll see his name first, Milton Wright. My oldest ancestor there, my great-grandmother, Betsy Madison. She's the mother of Henry Madison, the first Black African-American councilman in Austin. She was the mother of the little cottage there that you see. It's not a cottage, it's a cabin there at Rosewood Park. She came here with some of her adult sons from Bastrop. That was in the late 1860s. She had several prominent sons, and they have marked graves. My great-grandfather has a very well marked grave, Reverend C.L. Madison and his wife Jenny. He also was he was a minister there at Wesley for three periods. They would rotate ministers. They used to rotate ministers. Ministers couldn't stay around a long time. They rotate you every 2 or 3 years. But he died in 1900. But my great-grandmother, Jenny, she raised the rest of her children. They had 11 kids. She raised her 11 children in a house there at 1167 Angelina, where the museum is. Three groups of Madisons live right there along Angelina, where the Carver Branch Museum is, and the library. Actually, I remember the front porch. It was that recent because that house was torn down during urban renewal. It stayed there until that period of time. But I have other relatives there that were not so prominent, and they don't have prominent headstones. Those were the real, the real warriors, I would say, because they were the ones that were building the roads, and building the buildings. And those are the ones that need markers. When I came a couple of weeks ago to see Jennifer, I was a little shocked. I told her I was really just coming to, get me some markers for my family, for those that are unmarked, because my great-grandfather, who was the oldest, like I said, he came in 1850. He had to have been maybe 25. His owners, Dr. Wright and his wife, Rachel, they owned much of the property there in Mueller, where the Mueller Airport used to be. Well, prior to that, they bought about 300 acres. And that's where the Wright name came from. He took the name of his master. But I have, if you turn over any dirt there in the colored section, you're gonna come across some of my family, I'm sure. Because I do have some very deep roots. Even though I grew up in the Methodist ministry, and that's what my grandpa, great-grandpa Wright, with Wesley as a Methodist church, my great-grandmother Betsy was actually one of the founding members of Ebenezer, one of the charter members. There were 18 women that organized the Ebenezer Baptist Church. So I have a lot of reasons for wanting to be part of whatever this initiative is. And if you're handing out headstones, I'm sure I got some family members that could use some, if that's what you're gonna do. So that's part of my story. And that's part of why I'm here.
Thank you, Ms. Lott. I know we're going to be hearing a lot more from you, but thank you for sharing that history. Darwin?
Yes, I'm Darwin Hamilton. I am a fifth generation Austinite from my paternal grandmother's side, which is the Dedricks. So my ancestral home is the Dedrick Hamilton House, the historic house at 912 East 11th Street, which is the site of the African American Cultural and Heritage Facility. And the reason that is significant is because that is the oldest house in Robertson Hill as far as African Americans owned and bought during Reconstruction of the 1870s. So the earliest recorded ancestor from that 1870s census is my second great grandfather, Thomas Dedrick, and his wife, Ella, who is buried in the cemetery, and they have a shared monument there at the cemetery. And so they had a couple of sons, which is William Thomas Dedrick and Simon Dedrick, who was one of the trustees of Wesley United Methodist Church and the original founders. And I've often wondered whatever happened to him because the records were hard to find. And so someone reached out to me on Ancestry and found a publication in a magazine where he had moved to Oakland and became a businessman in the early 20th century there, and that is where he died. William Thomas Dedrick is featured in the center of the mosaic tile mural there at 912 East 11th Street, and so that is my great-grandfather. And he is also buried there in Oakwood, as well as his daughter, my grandmother Jewel, and her mother Sarah Dedrick, whose maiden name is Williams. Also, my grandmother's sister, Tilly Dedrick, which her maiden name is Stewart, and I believe her son, Benjamin Stewart, is also buried next to her in that plot, but I don't think there's a marker for his grave. And so that is my family who's buried there in the cemetery from the Dedricks Stewarts. And then also my second great grandfather had a business partner named Adam Shepherd, who is also buried with the family, even though he may not have been, blood relative. He has a small marker there in the grave, in the cemetery. And so what I found significant about just researching and learning their histories and how they were even able to buy property there on East 11th Street. And so it's quite a significant story of accomplishment, because when I looked at the deeds, I found that that land was owned by George W. Shelby, who was a Republican freedman's, a part of the Freedmen's Bureau and a principal that taught African Americans. And so he would sell them that property in the 1870s for $112 worth of gold, with a $400 promissory note to be paid off in 24 months. And adjusting for inflation today, that would be considered about $9,300 back then. And so they were able to accomplish that, as well as pass that house down 5 generations to me, and it remained in the same family until 2003. And this is where the story takes a different turn, because the city would sue us for that property through eminent domain and take it. So my family has no rights to the actual site that bears our name. And I still find that problematic to this very day, even though it's been about 17 years since that property was taken. And it doesn't tell the story that I'm narrating to you all. And so I consider that a monument of erasure. And so I appreciate the work that you all are doing to not erase the history of our ancestors who are buried there in the Oakwood Cemetery.
Thank you, Darwin. Sergio, Melinda?
Yeah, my name is Sergio Idwegas, and I was, just to answer the questions, I was born here in San Antonio. My family has been here for 11 generations. I moved to Austin in 1984 to go to college there after graduating from high school for 2 years, and stayed there, gosh, a lifetime. And then we moved back to San Antonio in 2012 to help take care of parents. I'm a professional archaeologist, and I've been doing this for 36 years. And I've worked with the Texas Historical Commission, and I've done work for the agency as well as cities, Austin, San Antonio, National Park Service, and I specialize in Spanish colonial archaeology as well as diaspora archaeology. And knowing the cultural practices within African American sites, and knowing where the cultural material assemblages are and what types of assemblages those are, can give clues to certain burial patterns as well. And I know, Jennifer, the image that you showed is a computer generated image. And I was wondering if the green burials have all the same name, because I would imagine there would be a lot more family burial plots that may be laid out in a specific way. There's different ways to try to determine where the unmarked burials are. And it was Texas Historical Commission policy that when dealing with with historic cemeteries that did not have a historic boundary, but a modern boundary, for every known grave, there were at least 3 unmarked graves, and having over 2,000 burials certainly fits the case here. There's different ways that the burials could be located through magnetometer that kind of survey, but those will only give you anomalies. There's also newer technology now through satellite spectral data analysis that used to be on satellites. And for instance, in the early 90s, the lost city of Ubar, the frankincense capital of the Middle East, was discovered. Today's technology with drones and sensors can look for concentrations of calcium that could be plotted on a map that could indicate where some of these burials are. But a lot of that would be a fantastic project for a graduate student to try and do. There's a few doctors here from the University of Texas, and I would imagine that there are some professors and some students who are already working on this type of technology. And I've been working with Jennifer for the past few months, and we've also done work with the Travis Audubon Society, dealing with Fort Colorado, and doing a lot of the earliest history of when Captain Zebulon Pike came through in 1806. And he talks about there being a settlement out here that was a Spanish station. It was probably most likely a ranch that was associated with the overall settlement of Mina that was between Bastrop and Austin. And there is earlier settlement evidence in East Austin that dates prior to 1836 in the general area, one of them being Fort Prairie, the town of Fort Prairie. So there's a lot more history in Austin that a lot of people just don't know about. And the last thing I'd like to say is that it has been documented that typically where there are historic cemeteries, it was a cemetery because it used to be a place where people were buried in the first place. And that goes back to Spanish colonial use, and that goes back to indigenous use. So the land had a purpose, and it's part of the accumulative landscape in that general area. And so as different people came into town, they just used the ground for the same purpose. And so what I'm trying to say here is that there's a lot of known marked burials in Oakwood, and there's going to be the ones that we know of through the written record that are African American, and there will be others that may be on the periphery of the general area.
And I'm Melinda Irwegas, and I am Sergio's research partner. And we have been working on these various projects since 2014. I believe we're on volume 23 or 24 of doing combination of historic resources studies and archaeological investigations to verify that kind of data. My background is I'm originally from Ohio. I am Scotch Irish. My family got here in the 1720s, 1730s. And I'm a daughter of the American Revolution. According to my DNA studies, some of my relatives came to Texas. I haven't quite figured out who those are. And but I got to Texas in the 1990s, and I found my home in Austin and fell in love with the cultural diversity. And it was a place where I was able to grow as a person and meet my husband. And we've been on this journey together for the last 20 years. So.
Well, thank you very much for those introductions. And I think we're just gonna carefully nudge into the next part of our conversation. And I think each of you has already touched upon it. And when we first started this presentation, Jennifer shared the goals and said that, you know, right now we're going to be trying through this specific grant and project to capture the actual stories, and what way do we need to do that? And I know, Darwin, you mentioned that, you know, many times there is a significant occurrence that happens through the city or through some type of event, and it does erase the history. And so in this moment, we're trying to ask you, how would you like us to capture and begin to tell the story as we use these new technologies to do that? So just a couple of things I want you to think through as we're going through this conversation. If we were to fast forward 100 years from now, how do you believe this story should be told? And just wherever you want to begin and however you want to share that. And then more importantly, those of you who are descendants, we know there's a lot of history that was just covered in this short introduction, but how do you want your family in the future to learn about your ancestors? So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you. And again, however you want to begin that conversation, we're just really trying to get a better picture so that we can inform the way this project's going to roll out and how you envision us characterizing and building this project together.
I mean, I'll go. I like the idea of it being a digital project simply because based on technology and where our future is going, it would be around for however many years, even past 100 years, hopefully, if we're all still here. What I think would really be significant, which is the tradition of oral history, is to record our voices that could be heard 100 years from now, because we don't hear the voices of the people from 100 years ago.
Mr. Hamilton, do you mind me asking, in terms of us hearing your voices and people in the future hearing your voices, what story would you want to tell? What should they know?
They should know, of course, I mean, we know that our history doesn't begin with slavery. However, that is as far as we can go, most of us as African Americans. But there's also that story of triumph through adversity. And so for my family, I would share that, because what they accomplished in spite of those circumstances is significant, and thread that as far as we could go potentially, because none of us knows where our family name is going to, or when it's going to end. And the reason I say that is because the Dedricks don't exist here in Austin, Texas. I mean, my last name is Hamilton through the marriage of my grandmother. So it's that kind of thing is where I'm getting at, because legacy is important. And so often we have people who are related to us, but we don't know who they are because many of us don't know past our grandparents.
Thank you, sir.
I think digital is good. But I think some sort of visual impact needs to be made. Although we can determine where some of the visual that you showed remains, the potential of remains just much on each other. So to create a headstone for each one of those would be difficult. We all have to accept the fact that we are, when at death, the same. We're just dirt to dirt. We all go to dirt. The damage has been done as far as stacking those bodies and giving them no designated or having designated spots. But to memorialize those souls with monuments like you do in a veterans memorial, a veterans hospital, a veterans cemetery, if there were sections where there were just rows and rows of unmarked, they're unmarked graves, so they can be unmarked stones to represent the souls that are buried there. So that when a person comes, and I don't know what the intentions are or how far the city wants to go to memorialize the people that did do some of the hard, did all the hard, did the hard work, dug, paved, cleared the streets, built the houses, built the buildings. How do you memorialize those people? Just leave it out there just for digital, a digital story. Some people just want to go to a cemetery just for the solitude of being in a cemetery and respecting the decedents. So a digital project would be good too, but I think something more than just a single monument. If it had to be 500 monuments, unmarked souls, so be it. But there's a visual, this is saying these are the souls, these are people. These are some of the people that built Austin, Texas in the early years. And that could be a project in itself. I don't know. I don't know what the city wants to do. The city of Austin takes on initiatives to try to make amends, so to speak, for what has happened. Well, it's happened. But to leave the ground there unmarked, I don't know. I think the ground should be marked. I think that the souls, there should be some symbolism of burials there. You go to the other sections of the cemetery, there are symbols of burials. And I think that that's what needs to be done or considered.
Ms. Lott, may I ask a question, please?
Yes.
In memorializing those folks, as you say, the people who contributed to building Austin, to building the city, because that's who we're talking about here. Like you mentioned before, when you in your introduction, these are people who are like the unsung heroes. They're
Right.
not right. They're not written down in the historical records because they
No.
weren't founding churches and so forth. What do you think people what if we were to do historical research about these Black, brown communities, poor whites? What kinds of things would you want to know about these people, so that in addition to here are these folks buried, and here's something that we can say about what their lives might have been like? What kinds of questions would you want us to research?
Well, many of the burials there are people that had a lot to do with the building of East Austin, especially. Well, Austin, because the burials go back into the before 1900. The burials go back before that. I mean, when you say what stories would you want to tell, sometimes the most exciting stories are from the most notable people. So how do you tell the story of a farmer or the merchant that sold vegetables? But you do memorialize him by saying he was here, by putting a stone there for him. I mean, when you say tell a story,
Yeah, what I mean is, I'm not thinking about individual stories, because we will probably never know who these, their names
No.
or find anything.
Yeah.
But say, we could, there could be stories told about enslaved and free Black laborers who worked in construction, who did stonemasonry, who
Right.
had, who were trained in carpentry. There could be stories about the demographics of the communities. What were the marriage rates of Black and Mexicans and whites who lived in Austin? And we could start getting at, pictures of health and access to various kinds of resources. So it would be a general story. It wouldn't be specific to a particular person, because unfortunately we're not able to do that. But we want to, I think us as a project team, and of course we need your input on it, but we want to present these folks not as just what killed them, how did they end up in the cemetery, but what were their lives like, right? And I think that's one of the questions on there is like, what lens should we be telling the story? Should it be a neighborhood lens that captures East Austin over time? Or should it be a city of Austin lens? Should it tell a Texas story? Yeah.
Yeah, it would be difficult to integrate much of that with East Austin, because East Austin was created much later than when the cemetery originally was developed as a city cemetery. The numbers that Jennifer gave earlier for the demographics early on, that there were 30% Blacks, well, yeah, they had to be there. They came, as many of them as like my Uncle Milton, my great grandpa Milton, he came as a slave. When he came, he was a slave. He was a slave for 20 years, well, 15 years, because he came in 52. So during that period of time in Austin, he came directly from Austin. My great grandmother, she was in Bastrop, but I say that to say that they had to tell the story. That is part of the story, that they were the laborers to create the city. And that these are the builders of the city, not necessarily the ones that are the other most notable people there, like, and I won't call any names, but there are some very notable, very notable founders there in Oakwood. Non-Black, not African-American, I mean. So, but they weren't digging, they weren't paving they weren't paved streets anyway. They weren't clearing the streets and clearing the city.
So it sounds like a main storyline that you would like to see told, that you think is important to include, is how is it that just ordinary folk, what were their contributions to the building of the city? Which really depended, it was on their backs that the city's prosperity was built.
Right.
So that's a story that you think is important to tell.
Yeah, I would like to add also a migration story of how they arrived. Where did they come from with their slave masters, if they were enslaved? Where did those people come from? Where did they migrate to? Because we hear stories about the Great Migration post, emancipation here in the United States, but where did all of these Black people come from throughout the United States to arrive here in Austin, and why?
I think both of these threads or lenses are great, and especially the migration story of people coming to Austin, because there is in essence, that reason, that connectivity. They all came together, lived together, worked together, although some of those people worked in bondage for other people, and then they died together and were buried here in this cemetery, but obviously under very different circumstances, which I think is an important part of the story. So thank you for bringing that up, Darwin. And Ms. Lott, you spoke about, the ordinary people, and then I'm studying more deeply African-American builders and craftsmen here in Austin. So that thread that you're talking about in particularly is vastly interesting to me, but also in these people's ordinariness and their contributions, that makes them notable. So even though they're not the necessarily, Jacob Fontaines or, Andrew Jackson Hamiltons or whoever of Austin, their everyday contributions make them significant in that way, in my opinion. And I think somehow highlighting or expanding that story just to indicate their contributions and their importance, because otherwise we wouldn't have the city of Austin, really, is really important. So thank you both for those ideas.
I was going to say, as we, talk about how even way back when, how Austin has changed and how Austin is changing now, and kind of the importance of really getting all these stories. Because in reality, it's, we're trying to preserve that history that people who maybe move here and have no idea about, what the East Side is or was, or the truth of the matter. It's a way to make sure that those stories, are not forgotten and not lost, because who knows what Austin will look like 100 years from now. And so I think it's really important that whatever we end up doing, that we try to make sure that we're telling this story in a way that whether or not people are visiting or moving here for the first time, they can actually know and understand the full story of Austin. Valor, like you said, people would be familiar when they drive by and they see Andrew Zilker's big memorial, and of course Zilker Park. And so it's really interesting how the people who had money and power and influence in life still kind of have that in death, because they were able to afford the larger and nicer monuments, versus the everyday people like us who maybe were, not governors or anything like that, but we still contribute to wherever we work or whatever we're doing. We're not just waiting around, we work and do things, to make sure that the story of the everyday person is told. And also, what was that like? How was it, how was it, how was it to buy land, buy property? What were the conditions like where we were, able to live? And one thing that kind of comes to mind is, you think about bringing people to a place, forcing people to a place, and then forcing people into an area. And then decades later, their descendants have to leave, for reasons, and then the history just gets lost. And so I think this is a conversation that I don't know why, I don't know who else has tried to have this conversation, but I really hope that through this process, we can really try to save these stories and this history, because it doesn't necessarily matter if everybody in the world reads it, but it's important to make sure that it's recorded, because it will serve as not only a learning point, but just an important part of remembering all these people who, as you all have said, have basically built early Austin. So, yeah.
Other than the Fontaine Monument or plaque, are there any others to denote some of the other people like there in the cemetery?
Jennifer, how many historic markers do we have? 7 or 8 or?
I can't answer that accurately. But there's only one historic marker in the historic colored grounds. And
That's what I mean. It's only one.
Mhm. Our friends group has an initiative to start writing more undertold history marker applications, but just one right now.
That may be a consideration if you do visit, well, I'm sure you have, we may not have, but some of the older historical cemeteries, they may have historical markers right there by the monument, you know, to say who this person was. Well, we may not be able to designate exactly where somebody is, but there are some important people that are buried there in Oakwood Cemetery that were instrumental in the African-American community, not necessarily East Austin, but in the African-American community of Austin. That could be memorialized like a historical plaque, you know, scattered throughout that section. That would be a consideration also. Digital is good. It's a good thing. It's a permanent, and it can be exponentially shared. If you know, as far as some of the elements of any kind of digital presentation, but to physically be in a place and to go and to experience it physically, you need to have some things to tell a story. You have to tell a story there, right there, on the grounds. And a person that, I mean, I don't know, a person that visits cemeteries, they don't want to visit a cemetery in the chapel. They want to visit the cemetery. Some enhanced beautification, other than just to say this is where all the unmarked, this is the unmarked colored section. No.
Ms. Lott, I appreciate you saying that, because I mean, that's one of the things, like, for example, my ancestral home, the city of Austin contracted artist Reginald Charles Adams to do that mosaic tile mural. And the reason he said he used mosaic tile is because that mural will last 100 years because mosaics weather the storms, the condition, and so on and so forth.
Right.
And for me personally, I went on a journey to all of the cemeteries to find my ancestors and connect my roots. And I mean, I didn't even know where they were buried, but it was like something just guided me to them, and I found them in Oakwood. I knew where my grandmother was, but I hadn't been in years, but I didn't know where her mother was, and I didn't know where her grandfather was.
Mhm.
And I just started walking through that black section. And then once I saw the monument for Thomas and Ella Dedrick, it was just so, you know, I can't even describe how I felt to land on that. And then that led me to some of the other ancestors, headstones that I didn't know were there, right? So I appreciate you mentioned that, because it was surreal for me to do that. And then I went to other cemeteries where I knew my people were, but I didn't know where their headstones were. And I just walked until I found the names and saw their headstones.
Can I ask a question of folks about, we had in another focus group meeting, we had a discussion about, it's called the historic colored grounds. And I was curious as to what your feelings are about that designation, using that, keeping that historic name, explaining why it was called that. But I mean, does it offend you for us to use that for the digital history, for the digital project?
Let me say, for me, I want the world to be reminded of what happened to my people. So no, I don't have a problem with that. Now, don't put it on the restroom anywhere, but don't have a colored section somewhere else. But no, I wouldn't be offended at all. I want it to be what it is and what it was and what it was called at the time. And it brings on what it was. It paints a picture of what it was and what it is and what happened. Especially if you include in your presentation the digital image of all of those burials, how they were just randomly, almost randomly done. I don't know.
I would, yeah, I would echo, I'm not offended by the term in its historical context. However, I will say that I'm a proponent of person-centered language versus dehumanizing language. So whatever that is, or whatever is come up with, I mean, I think it should be person-centered language.
Is there something missing that we're not asking as we think about this project? And I know we have about 20 minutes here together. Or is there something that was brought up in this conversation as we've been in discussions that we need to dive in a little bit further? Or if there's anyone from the project team that has an additional question.
What was your plan? What is your plan? What is the city's plan?
Our plan is to be informed by you.
It
is. And to have these subject matter experts help lead the conversation instead of just city staff. Right? To have real citizen accountability from the city does not mean that should be a city-led activity, right? So you're right, digital is a great place to start. And that's what we got the grant for. So that's where we're starting with this here.
We've asked the focus groups participants what they want to see, which is a very broad and open-ended question. As we can see, is there anything that you don't want to see, whether that's in whatever is created digitally or ultimately perhaps on the ground in the cemetery, in the historic colored grounds?
that's a difficult, it's a cemetery. When you say don't want to see, what did you have in mind that would be so offensive that or what has been
There's
talked
stories
about
that
at
you
the other
don't
group?
want told, or, you know, or think are less important, perhaps.
Can we be privy to what some of the other descendants may have thought about that same question?
Is this my first time asking a question?
Oh.
Yeah, I'm struggling with what I don't want to see it. You know, I'm with Ms. Lot there. I'm trying to wrap my mind around what I wouldn't want to see that I haven't already seen. You know, as far as historical reenactments of the era.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I guess I would say I'm desensitized to it to a degree as to what would offend me in that way, if that makes sense. So, you know, I'm kind of leaning more as to what I would want to see, just based on, you know, the Austin History Center and what kind of images could be provided as to what the area looked like at the time, what ordinary people's professions were. Like, for example, in the historical record, my second great grandfather was a teamster. Well, when I hear the word teamster, I'm thinking about the mafia, but that's not what teamsters were.
That's right.
So, you know, images of those kinds of things, what people did who lived in this community at that time.
Thank you.
I would like to just at least also point out that Miss Lott, you had already mentioned one of the things that you would like to see that you wouldn't want to see it. Basically, you said you didn't want to see it left open and all green without something to memorialize the ground right there, because it just looks like green open space. And so that's something that has already been stated of what would not want to be seen.
Mhm.
It's just the absence of recognition.
That. And we may have unmarked clusters of unetched monuments to represent families and maybe benches. I mean, because at this point, when you go to a cemetery, okay, when I go to a cemetery, I try not to walk on anybody's grave.
Right. Yeah.
But I think you don't know where any graves are. So it's just, we're beyond that now of trying to stay in our lanes in the cemetery. So that if we did want to create some areas, you know, for some clusters of burial sites, what appear to be unmarked stones, like at a veteran cemetery, and maybe have some areas where they're, you know, maybe bronze children or bronze elderly people, or have a set of bronze figurines of 7 or 8 people having a funeral, to say that this is where people had funerals. You could create an environment out there that's, yes, it's a burial site, but it could be an environment. You could create an outdoor environment in certain sections like that. I mean, a cemetery in Austin is controlled by Parks and Recreation. It is a park. It's a park of burials you know, so it could be, we could make it more like a park type environment. But have some clusters of burial, you know, and where it may be like it's a family group of, I don't know. But to leave it the way it is to say, oh, we're just talking to y'all. We just, you know, but just to leave it, continue in the path that it's going. I don't know if I like that.
I know one thing that is usually surprising to, you know, guests that stop by is a lot of times people are actually shocked that Oakwood Cemetery is still an active burial site, you know, because it's the association that this is an old cemetery. And, you know, and so I think when people realize that, maybe for a moment it changes kind of what they initially thought, like people are still being buried here. Maybe I should kind of, you know, conduct myself in a certain way that's respectful for those people. And, you know, when I think about the people who are buried here who either have markers or don't have markers, and even people who do have markers, but maybe their families don't even live here and haven't lived here for years. And maybe there's no way to reach out to anybody to tell them that, you know, their family's monument has fallen over just over time. And, you know, maybe there's a chance that at this stage, due to the age, there's a way to have lots or monuments to basically have groups or individuals either sponsor either resetting monuments, or I've seen it done at other historic cemeteries on the West Coast where people step up, groups step up, you know, individuals who want to, you know, help out, step up and sponsor some of that work, because then you're telling people kind of the issues, and you're asking for help from people who might be able to help. And because you have to assume that as the years continue to go on and descendants, you know, don't live here anymore or die out, that their families' lots will, you know, one day have no one to you know, check in on things or reset things. So the idea of maybe potentially opening that stuff up to people who can maybe sponsor some of that work might help the city just in general, as far as trying to get ahead of all of that work, because obviously it's just a matter of time before at a lot of our older cemeteries that there's just so much work to be done and it's impossible. It'd be good to have a way for people to sponsor or donate to help with some of that work, I think.
Well, Greg, I was talking about some fake, I would call them fake families. But so, you know, just make a park near the chapel there, some areas that are not necessarily doing monument preservation. I wasn't talking about that. That's a whole different thing to, you know, go in and try to do some monument preservation on some of those that have fallen. And in a section like that, no, the city is not going to come over there and take care of us. So that's going to happen in older vintage cemeteries. But I thought we were talking about something new to just memorialize what you're trying to do now. And
Are there any?
That's what I was talking about as far as creating little clusters here and there of fake, I don't mean to say fake families,
Yeah.
but just a like.
Are there any symbols or anything that kind of come to mind, you know, if that's ever a possibility where, physical markers could be installed, because if we don't necessarily know who is buried where, and we don't necessarily know, you know, what their beliefs were in life, are there any symbols or shapes that you think could represent um
Well,
that?
yeah, just a plain stone, just like you have in veterans in some of the over there at the state cemetery. Some of the stones are just lined up stones.
So kind of like
At Arlington Cemetery, any of the veterans type cemeteries, you have just, and that is a symbolism of something. But now it's nothing. But we don't know who those people are. So we can't put anybody's name on it, because we're just doing it to memorialize some people there. Maybe one group of 15 little bitty small white headstones in that area. That may be 200 people. But we're just creating a little bitty, just to have scattered around like little flower beds almost throughout the section of little clusters of cemeteries. They may, in symmetry, of course, not just throw them out there, but make it look like a park. Make it look good. And have some symmetry to the little clusters, and maybe have some benches and have some fake, I say fake, but bronze figurines of some families that maybe come into the cemetery or something. There are any number of ways you could create a park-like setting, or for that fact, a cemetery setting. Create a cemetery setting. We don't know who they are, so no, they can't. We're not gonna have all erratic shapes, have all the shapes the same. It reinforces that we don't know who these people. It reinforces that they're the whole unmarked grave thing.
I would add to that. I mean, when we think about some of the prominent people in the cemetery who aren't people of color, and how significant some of their monuments are. So, I mean, this undertaking, on a grand scale, for that area, I don't know how big it is. To Valor's point, there could be something substantial in that space to amplify that these people were here and that they were important collectively, even though we don't know their names. There could be significant enough monuments there, whether it was 5 or 10, that are grand enough to say, this is, the people of color who were buried in this part of the cemetery. Now, what that looks like architecturally, I don't know it. I'm just thinking about, how grandiose some of these monuments are in the white sections of the cemetery versus the Black section of the cemetery.
Was there any last final minute comments before we get ready to log off here? Well, I want to thank you for being here. We know in a short period of time, sharing these stories and trusting us with your story, because we know that it does take that level of trust of saying that we will do good and do right by what you're sharing with us tonight. And I was thinking just about even your story, Darwin, when you mentioned of your mom and the names. You know, my mom this weekend went to go see her mother's grave, and I went with her. And for some reason, she was the way she was, and I wanted to capture her at this bench, but the bench says Rodriguez. And my mom's the only daughter in her family, and she's a Martinez, and the graves will mark Rodriguez. So I will only be able, and my family, to capture that history. So, and I see something that just popped up in the chat, but I do appreciate the stories that you're sharing. And it's meant a lot to us to spend some time with you today. And Melinda, if you had something to add, I'm sorry if I cut you off there. So let me give you that time.
No worries. I'm listening to what everyone is saying. And Jennifer came up with a round number. I'm not quite sure if that's from historic written records, how that came about. And so there's some form of reference in many of the historic written records that families even have, that they know. And having like a centralized monument, yes, having places to document where people were, but also having a place that has what was in the written record. What was the name, even if it's a singular name, even if it's, you know,
What was the name of that source?
What was the name of that source? And being able to see that it is a piece of history that's been documented in some form or another, whether it's in family Bibles or whether, you know, because there's so many things that families can bring in. I mean, just even the information that Ms. Lott brought in about having a family plot, you know, that is a historic written record that documents, and having that on some type of monument, you know, referencing that could also be a way of paying respect and documenting and showing a bit of the history. That's all I was going to say.
And to that end, I think this digital project can accomplish a lot of these different things. There are ways that we can show individual markers, that we can show maybe one or two substantial markers, you know, that represent certain demographics or constituents of people. And I think would also allow an opportunity for Parks and Rec, Save Austin Cemeteries, or whatever organizations are going to be involved, to consider how some of these digital representations can actually be placed physically on the landscape. And certainly with, you know, clicking on a tombstone of, you know, where we do have a name of an individual, that's something that's digital, and being able to bring up things like the entry from the logbook of the cemetery, or a birth certificate, or family photos that people have shared, and other things that are being found. So all of this information, you can see how important your thoughts and what you've shared with us this evening will help us to consider some of these things that we might recommend that the city staff do once they're actually creating the digital product that's going to come out of this work. So your feedback has been extremely constructive and helpful this evening. So I just want to say thank you before we all close off.
Thank you all for the invitation and the opportunity to share. I just happened up on this because I commented on the Oakwood Cemetery, I guess, Facebook page, and someone told me to contact Jennifer Chenoweth. And so that's how I landed here.
And we're so glad you did. We're so glad that you did.
Yeah, because there was a picture of my second great grandmother on the cemetery's page, and it was a picture that I don't personally have, but some of my relatives do. So I commented and said, "This is my second great grandmother," and someone responded to me that way. So yeah.
Thank you, everyone, for sharing. It's greatly appreciated.
Yeah, just wanted to say thanks, Sergio and Melinda, Darwin and Valor. Thanks for being here and giving us your input and telling your stories. And I hope you all continue to do so and to, document your family's, history, and also in the meantime, document your own, because we all have stories and we never know how your story or your life can impact someone 100 years from now. So thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.
Thank you very much.